Okay, so hi everyone. Everyone's gone spontaneously quiet, so that must mean it's time to start. So welcome to this event in our series on histories of race and capitalism. This is, run by a collective, and we've been going for a few years now. So I'd just like to thank my co-organisers, who are Sarah, Samia, and Henny, and also Tanvi, mostly dotted around the place. So obviously we have with us tonight Professor Tithi Bhattacharya, who teaches at Purdue University in the US. Her discipline is actually South Asian history, but her work spans an incredible range of themes, including most famously social reproduction theory and Marxist theory as well. And she's made really incredible contributions to Marxist feminism over the years. So we've invited Tithi today to really as the author of the wonderful new book, Ghostly Past, Capitalist Presence, and she'll be speaking about that book shortly. But I'll also urge you to read her other works, including co-authored classics such as Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto, which has been translated into over 30 languages. It's amazing. And she also has works in a really impressive array of academic and public publications, including Journal of Asian Studies, South Asia Research, The Nation, and New Left Review. And we're also really lucky to have as discussant Tania Bhattacharya, who is a historian of urbanity, migration and labour in the 19th and 20th century, Indian Ocean and South Asia. And their book manuscript, Ocean Bombay, Space, Itinerancy and Community in an Imperial Port City in 1839 to 1945, follows itinerants from East Africa, Southern Arabia, and Persian Gulf to Bombay to tell the story of Bombay's transition from an ocean-facing port city to a nation-facing mill city. They are currently a research fellow in Colonial Studies at the University of Cambridge, and hopefully we'll have them back again very soon to talk about the book when it's a great book out. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Tithi to take away her talk. Thanks very much.
Salam, everyone. Thank you, Lisa, and all the organizers to invite me back to my alma mater, SOAS, where a lot of my misspent youth was misspent. And so I am going to talk to you today about ghosts. These are not Derridian ghosts. These are not metaphoric ghosts. These are actual ghosts. And why is it important in any way to talk about ghosts from a Marxist feminist? Why is she writing a history of ghosts? And so part of that is trying to convince you as to why a history of ghosts in a colonial context is important and what our ghosts will tell us about colonialism and capitalism. So part of the project is trying to convince you of that, and you can tell me during the Q&A whether that job was completed successfully. So the theme of this book is what happens when capitalism meets pre-capitalist ghosts. And this is a very rather poor AI picture of a capitalist meeting some pre-capitalist ghosts. I feel very sorry for the ghosts, and I'm sure you do too, because they look pretty hapless. And they will continue to look very hapless in many of the stories that were actually collected by the 19th century Bengali ethnographer or the newly minted folklorist. Because as you can imagine, no such creature existed before. There were no ethnographers or folklorists. So that's part of the project of colonial knowledge gathering and knowledge production. And these people literally went into the countryside to capture ghosts and ghost stories. And in these stories, if you look carefully, the ghosts are often made into servants by very, very clever and wily artisans and even peasants. They are often punished for having done some ghostly minor offenses by humans. And most often they are rendered into servitude for all eternity because they were defeated in some clever game that the human devised, and they serve the human for the rest of their life, the human's life that is, in bringing them riches or, you know, doing their bidding or something. So your pet ghost, really. And so in all of these stories, that's what it feels like, that when the human meet the ghosts, you feel rather sorry for the ghost. And all of these folk tales, the humans, and these are pre-capitalist ghost stories, they're pre-colonial, importantly, ghost stories. In all of these, the humans are usually some part of the pre-colonial rural life. So they're either barbers or artisans, craftspeople of some kind. They're often peasants. They're often fishermen or some part of the village rural tapestry. So that's who are the protagonists of these stories. I also want you to understand that the pre-capitalist ghosts are very different from the ghosts you will meet once colonialism takes root in this region called Bengal, okay? The ghosts that you will meet post the capitalist transition or the capitalist hazardness rather, are of a very different nature. They look very different, they sound very different, and they have a different moral agenda from these ghosts. So I want you to pay attention to how these guys actually look like here, because I gave AI and actually would cut a picture from one of these folktale books, and the AI made a hash of it and created this. However, the basic sort of contours of the ghost remains the same. And as you can see, he and his little being are very different in a way from the way we look, yes? And they're, and this is going to play an important role in what I will argue are the roots of difference between the pre-colonial ghosts and the colonial ones. And just one word before we move on, that these ghosts, these pre-colonial ghosts, strike fear in your heart through their fearsome appearance, okay? So look at their eyes and their ears, and, you know, some of them are without their heads, so they're the headless ghosts, yeah? So it's so on and so forth. So they are attempting to scare you through their fearsome look. Now, contrast that with a modern Gothic ghost story. The way the story leads you to fear is through the absence of the ghost. it is that swish of the curtain, or subtle sounds on the floorboards, or the sound of jewelry somewhere, or someone crying. Yeah. So when finally the ghost does appear, it's actually the end of the story, right? But throughout the build-up in a Gothic story, which is a modern ghost story, the ghost is anticipated through her, and I will emphasize on the her, absence. Okay, and so just let's bear that thought and store it away when we go to the other parts. So this is here's another of my beings. Okay, and he lives on a date palm tree. Okay, his name is Akanori. And you scare your children with him if they do not fall asleep. You say, if you are not going to sleep, little one, he's going to come and get you from the date palm tree. And this is actually, again, one of the illustrations from a book of poems published in 1899. So I called this book History Writing in Minor Note. For those of you who are experts in music, you will know what that means. And the reason I say that is because of the following. From the 1850s onwards, there was a calcification, if you like, of religious beliefs and civic practices in Bengal, which tilted and tinged the nation towards Hindu majoritarianism. This process has been widely accepted by scholars who are not in the BJP, by actually established scholars. And these histories have been, it's a settled argument, as it were. And these histories of how that happened, and the gendering and the Hinduizing of the nation has been well studied. And that's the major note, yeah? So I am looking at this Hinduization and nationization through a minor note, through some beings who have both had the misfortune of the condescension of history, as E.P. Thompson called it, as well as the condescension of historians, because no one has actually studied these beings and their forms. And you will notice I call them beings because in pre-capitalist rural Bengal, each being had a separate name, and they were also known for very different separate functions, yeah? And they were also superbly powerful, okay? So there was often overlap between what we are shorthandedly and in a very bad modern way calling ghosts and divine gods. Okay, so there was often overlap. And this argument, I am very ambitious, so I will say that this argument of the pre-capitalist ghosts being different from the capitalist ghosts holds true globally. Okay, so you can test from the region that you either study or know best or come from whether this argument holds for you, and I absolutely guarantee that it will. Okay, so the argument then in the book is that pre-modern and modern ghosts carry a sharp contrast between them. A contrast that I argue is because a modern sense of the uncanny, for those of you who are familiar with Freud's argument, does not exist for our pre-modern ghostly beings. Instead, they follow a direct trajectory of fear and dread. So it's a very direct fear, yeah? So no intimations or anticipations. Usually the stories begin, and you will notice another big difference between the capitalist and the pre-capitalist being is a capitalist ghost story will begin with a haunted house or a human being going to a house even though they were warned not to go in or what have you. And so, but a pre-capitalist ghost story begins with, once upon a time, there was a ghost. Okay, so, and then you hear about the ghost's life. Okay, so the ghost who lived in this tree, had a wife, had little ghostly babies, or the ghostly feast that he attends, the ghostly dances that he does, and various stories will tell you about the ghost's life. He is or she is a being, okay? They have very, very clear dietary choices. They like fish. If you are buying fish, they will follow you home, okay? So because Bengal is a riverine country, yeah, so everybody loves fish. Why not the ghost? So what I argue in the book is that the fear of the pre-capitalist ghost is realism versus uncertainty, ambiguity, and terror. And in that sense, the pre-capitalist ghosts are actually not supernatural, they are natural. When you go into a dark forest, you will be given tools to fight a tiger, and you will be given tools like amulets or chanting to fight a ghost. Both are real. None of this is supernatural. In fact, the existence of the supernatural, and we'll go into some of the anthropologist arguments about this, does not exist, okay? Everything is natural, as it were. So this leads me very well into an anthropologist's intervention in this debate, where all of you know Marshall Sahlins, and this is his last book, where he makes an argument about immanentist societies versus transcendentalist societies. So in societies which value immanence, Sahlins argues that there is no distinction between the spiritual and the material. Okay, this distinction does not exist. The entire world is magical. Yeah, the entire world is enchanted, and a cosmic host of beings and forces comprise an all-round substrate. Okay, so there is no difference between the divine and the material. But for transcendentalist societies like ours, some modern societies, we have transported all divinity and magic and so on to another world, okay? And leaving the earth, as he puts it so brilliantly, only alone to humans. Okay, and this also explains, in a way, an argument we make about why humans are so unwilling to share this world with non-human beings of all kinds, or non-human living beings of all kinds. So here is another of my beings. She is a mighty queen, but she is actually a monster, a ghost, who tricks the king into appearing as a beautiful woman, and like any ordinary man, he falls for her and marries her. And then what she does is the king had a previous. I'm sorry. Are you okay with me telling some stories?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the king has an earlier wife who's human, and then he marries the monster wife. And the earlier wife has a human child, and the monster wife has a half human, half monster child. Yeah. Now, to the great annoyance of Monster Queen, the two brothers are absolutely, irrevocably close friends, and they can't do anything without the other. Okay, they are very, very, very close. So what the Monster Queen does is every night she turns into, when everybody, the humans are asleep, she turns into her original form. Look at her. She goes out and she eats people. She eats cows and animals and horses and elephants. Okay, so the kingdom starts to fail. Okay, because the economy is devastated by the Monster Queen. And yeah, exactly. And so, and the princes then, decide that they're going to do something about it. And this is the part I love the most. So what does the Monster Queen do? She eats both of the princes, including her own. And then she feels nauseous, and then she throws up in a field, and what she throws up are two metal balls, golden and silver. Okay. And then the story continues. But just to give you a sense of the power of these mighty beings, yeah? And they will not, these are not your Jane Austen heroines, okay? They are willing to eat their own son to maintain their power, okay? So these are very, I'm just giving you a sense of how important they are. With capitalism, and here we come to the centrality of the argument, what we have is an incorporation of beings, okay? And by incorporation of beings, what I mean is, look at the different kinds of beings we see displayed here, okay? Those are suddenly very popular in Bengal. So one of my graduate students went to Calcutta and brought me these coasters with the traditional Bengali ghosts on them, and I'm forever thankful to her. And now I'm using them for a tool. So there she is on the top left. She's a Pitni, who is a female ghost. This is a Shankarchurni or Shakchurni, who is a ghost who is completely pale in color. And both the Pitni and the Shakchurni, because they're women and they have voracious appetites, on the appetites, they love ghosts. They love fish. That is the headless guy, the Skandagata, and that, look at his hat. He is a Mando or a Muslim ghost. So that tells you who is living in the villages and what kind of beings are created. So from this diverse world of beings, we have an incorporation around the 1850s or 80s into the new Gothic form, okay? And the Gothic form is only that, okay? Only that. Now, those of you who are fans of the labor theory of value can see where this argument is going to go. And so this is basically what the book argues, that this incorporation of beings in the Gothic form is going to happen in every single part of the globe once capitalism or colonialism touches it, yeah? Because even in the global north, you will see various creatures and beings prior to the rise of the Gothic. And the Gothic takes the exact same form almost everywhere, okay? It's always the same. It is a large, sentient, almost mansion. There is a very gendered, sexualized unfulfillment at the center of it. And women are shown in these very gendered and sexualized tropes. There are templates, and so on and so forth. Very different from our powerful Pitni or Shakchurni. Yeah. So the Gothic is a very different creature, if you like, as we know it. But why? And this is where the global theory of value, the labor theory of value comes in. So this is, those of you who know Spanish history or you know art, know this painting quite well. It's by Goya, and he painted it in 1799. And it's in the Prado, actually. It is really, really scary to look at when you even see it up there. And you can see here already seeping into the culture this Gothic form, because what is scary for you is not the appearance of the being, but the hiding of the being in a hood. Yeah. So if actually he revealed his large teeth and large ears, you would laugh, wouldn't you? Because these pre-modern forms of ghostly beings were exiled later into children's literature. Yeah, so you would laugh if he suddenly sprouted ears or whatever. But this makes it really, really scary because it's the hint, it's the anticipation, it's the ambiguity. So why do these Gothic forms take the form that we now know from that previous thing? So the fundamental inscrutability of capitalism as a system, I argue, dictates certain specific forms for even the spectral world. And one of the lovely books I read while doing this research was actually a literature scholar, and it was called The Rise of Supernatural Fiction in Britain. And she goes on to really do a fantastic study of the Gothic. But one of the things she says is that while the real world expelled these, expelled sort of superstition, and there was just this, obsession with reason and rationality, the economic world was full of ghostly and spectral and divine metaphors, okay? And she talks at length about the invisible hand, the South Sea bubble. So all of these ways in which suddenly a new inscrutable economy was actually pulling the world in all different directions is reflected in how people talked about the economy, which you couldn't actually see. Okay, so that is one way to think about it. The other way, of course, is, as we know, capitalism homogenizes all concrete forms of labor. So this is a tendency in capitalism to homogenize concrete into abstract, okay? So all the different forms are then abstracted into the one form, okay? So it doesn't matter whether it's a laptop or a jacket or, my ring, they will all be sold in the market as the commodity, okay? So this is this sort of anti-diversification is the central driving force of capitalism to making all labors and all commodities exchangeable with each other because of their undifferentiated state. And you will see this in the spectral world as well. Everything is called a ghost. Okay, in the Gothic literature, everything is called a ghost. This diversification of ghosts just does not exist, okay? In fact, some of it is actually tamed. So elves, for instance, for those of you who are in the global north, elves used to be quite scary creatures, and so were fairies. They were capable of both good and evil, but they are sort of tamed and infantilized, put into children's storybooks. But the scary bit is the homogeneous ghost, okay, who haunts mansions, etc. So if you have read some of the extracts, one of the chapters talk about the master Gothic storyteller of 19th century Bengal, which was Rabindranath Tagore, who went on to win a Nobel, the first Nobel literature, in literature from India. So this is my argument in the book. As I said, that Bengal from the 1850s onwards, this particular field is dominated then by Western educated elite men. Women too, but mostly Western educated elite men. And the PhD I did right here many, many years ago was about that class formation. Like how did these, upper caste and upper class men become the bearers, the signature bearers of the nation, okay? So this is another aspect of that class that I study, which is these men worship reason, okay? In fact, reason as a metric is wielded as a baton against women, Dalits, Muslims, anyone who is vulnerable or lower class, okay? So all these people are irrational. The Bhadralok, or this, Western educated middle class, is the bearers of reason and the interpreters of reason. Now, what do they think of the pre-colonial ghosts? Superstition, of course. I mean, who would be scared of the Akanore with his ridiculous cauliflower ears and carrot-like teeth, tusks? So, of course, these are superstition, and only women, villagers, Dalits, and all these lowly human dust believe in them. We do not. What do we do in our drawing rooms? We practice seances, because that is very important, because it's scientific. Because seances and planchets are scientific ways to communicate with the beings from the afterlife. Okay, one of them even wrote in his autobiography that when you live in India and some of your relatives live outside of India, you use the telephone. Seances are just like telephones. We use that to call our loved ones who are dead. It's just a scientific tool. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that there emerged then what I call in the book this cult of scientific spirituality, with which this class carved a particular space between the nation and a very, very aggressive Hinduism, okay? And these scientific investigations were all conducted within this very, very exclusivist Brahminic frameworks. And I can tell you more about it in the Q&A. And I just want you to understand, perhaps, because maybe I'm not getting that across, that this is not a tiny minority in this middle class that's doing these practices, okay? A huge group. This is a huge group effort, okay? All the leading intellectuals, I will argue, of the city of Calcutta and its suburbs are practicing scientific spirituality, okay? All of them. The Tagores are famous for it. I'm not going to name names. I can tell you everything, but again, they all believe that this is a legitimately rational scientific way to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. And they believe that their particular access to Hindutva and Brahmanism allows them to do this in the best way possible. Okay. So one of them, Shishir Kumar Ghosh, he is a firebrand nationalist journalist, yeah. And his paper, the Amrita Bazar Patrika, it is a babe on the side of the British, okay, a thorn, and so he's very, very popular. He's very active, etc. But in his spare time, he does this, okay? He does seances and he does planchets, he does these ghost circles, etc. And he even edits a magazine, a journal called the Hindu Spiritual Magazine, okay? The Hindu Spiritual Magazine. And by that title, you can tell what the inclination of this magazine is going to be, okay? So this is, and this magazine turns out to be very, very popular. And as you can see, the object of the magazine is to render death, which has a horror for most men, easy to meet with. It contains articles calculated to throw light on life after death, on manifestations, on psychic experiences, and other cognate subjects of the spiritual world, bearing on mesmerism or the yoga system of the Hindu. And this was another way for India to prove this is an anti-colonial project, okay? This is another way through Hindu spiritualism to show how much more advanced India already was to the Western world, okay? India already had yoga and all of that Hindu stuff, where our great yogis were already communicating with the spiritual world, okay? The British the West is sort of helping us a little bit by, introducing these newfangled seances or etc. But we were the originators of these, ghost whisperers, right? And so this again proves how Hindu India was so much superior to the West and to the bloody Muslims, of course, right? So because they came and they just took our jobs, took our women, took everything, okay? So this is very, very blatantly stated in all of these magazines. And I'm giving you one. There are several, okay? The two most famous ones, one is by Shishir Kumar Ghosh, and it's called, and it's this one. The other is published in Bengali, in Bangla, by someone called Kirot Prasad Vidya Binod, who was a chemistry professor in one of the leading colleges of the city. And he published an exactly similar journal, which was also very popular, and in the 19th and early 20th century. So what happens to the pre-colonial beings, all those beautiful and powerful beings that we encountered partially? They're exiled. Here you see a Tagore, and here you see the Tagores were really into seances. And there's one story in the seances that I actually like, which is they called to the seance a close family friend who had just passed away. And he said, "Hey, Uncle X, how are things out there?" And Uncle X was supposed to be a very witty person. And he said, "Oh, why am I going to share the knowledge I've found by dying to you who haven't died yet?" So, yes. So this is the kind of ghosts that were allowed in polite society. That is the quintessential Tagore story that was later made into a film by Satyajit Ray. So, you know, it just carries on with great men talking to great men about women. And so this is the haunted mansion in which that ghost story is set. So all these ghosts are now allowed in polite society, while our old the ghosts are exiled into either superstition or into children's books, which may or may not scare children, but will definitely not scare the rational adult. The old ghosts, I want to end by saying, had no moral agenda, okay? Just like a tiger doesn't have a moral agenda. If it's hungry, it'll eat you, okay? So the pre-colonial ghosts did not have any moral agenda. The Gothic ghosts, the modern ghosts, do have a moral agenda. There's usually a moral instilled at the heart of the story. You know, women should not be too sexual, or it is not good to crave or something, or, you know, whatever it might be, okay? So the unfulfillment of a moral agenda on earth makes you into a ghost, okay? So modern ghosts have moral agenda. So today, since we cannot bring back our pre-capitalist ghosts anymore because we've lost that world of beings, let us hope that our modern ghosts can continue with their moral agenda when it comes to the genocides and the wars that we are witnessing around us. This, I leave with you, is a brilliant, brilliant film by a Palestinian director, Lian, and it was made in 2023. It is called A House in Jerusalem. And in it, a Jewish young girl goes back to Jerusalem, to her grandmother's house from London. And in this house in Jerusalem, she meets Rasha, a Palestinian girl. But only she, who's the same age, 10 or 12, can see Rasha. Okay? So let us hope that the moral agenda that Rasha brings in the film can be with us always and forever, telling us of what kind of a moral world without genocide we can and should aspire to, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Tithi. That was so wonderful, and everyone loves a ghost story, especially when it's an anti-capitalist ghost story and a feminist one as well. So, yeah, I'd like to hand over to Tania now to share her discussions.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me to be at this talk today. I was definitely going to read this book. My brother read the book. His friend taught the book in class. So I think anybody who is Bengali has grown up to some extent, no matter how rational and atheist the family, with some amount of ghost stories. My brother and I used to have 3 pet ghosts when we were young. So the theme of the domesticated Bhadra ghost, who's non-threatening, it resonated with us. So well, I found we were assigned the chapters 3 and introduction and conclusion, and actually for me, chapters that were not assigned were the richest. So because these are the one. This book is a big exercise. It's based with a lot of Marxist theory, and Marxist theories both of capital and abstraction, but also Marxist theories of space and the production of space. But it is also very richly animated by stories, and stories written both by upper caste bourgeois families like the Tagore's, but also stories of the life worlds of poorer Brahmins or non-metropolitan Brahmins or Dalits and Muslims and ordinary people. And Bhattacharya collects these stories through the works of 19th century ethnographers. So we both kind of simultaneously get a view of ethnography as a discipline and how it's trying to sort of capture the ghosts and trap them in the proverbial bottle, but through the task of the ethnographer telling the stories and books. But you also she uses these ethnographic tools as a way into the mental life worlds of people who did not leave written accounts. And some of the chapters 1 and 2, are some of the richest chapters in terms of the immense. You've heard some of the stories, but like there are so many more. Like each variety of being comes with its particular characteristics, its particular traits, behaviors, preferences. And one of the things you realize, the reason why she calls these creatures beings and not just ghosts, which would be the simple translation of Bhut, is because there's this immense world of diversity, as much diversity as there is in the human world. So one of the points that the book makes very clearly for me is how in the pre-colonial world, there is this kinship between the human beings and the non-human beings. So ghosts are quite human-like, as in other cases we've read, gods are too. A lot of gods in these world also have very human characteristics. They're embroiled in petty battles. They are embroiled in love affairs, and the ghosts very much are also like that. So I just wanted to start by saying that if you've read only chapter 3 and not the others, definitely go back and read like the chapters that are very full of a lot of these stories, and all kinds of worlds open up. So I kind of asked myself, the book ends with a question. She says that you've tried to open up the cracks and sort of for a future. I mean, you ended here on a different note with like, what can the modern ghosts do for us? But I was asking myself the question at the end of the book, what do ghosts do for us as ways of imagining futures and also a way of understanding pasts? So that's the question through which I'll just organize the rest of my comments. I don't really have much my way of like serious critique, but more in terms of like provocation, in the sense of like, what do ghosts do for us as a political tool? But I'll come to that later. So asking myself the question, what do ghosts do for us after reading this book? The first thing it does is it historicizes fear. Following the ghost, as Professor Bhattacharya shows us that fear has not always been the same, and modern fear is very particular. And it is particular, and she uses Freud's notion of the uncanny. It took me a minute to understand. So one of the differences between the pre-colonial ghost and the colonial ghost that she points out is pre-colonial ghosts lived in the wild. They lived in the wild like tigers and dangerous animals and other creatures and other beings. Whereas colonial ghosts, the Gothic ghost comes to haunt the home. It took me a minute to understand why that is significant. Why is the home is the site of the haunting, and what is particularly modern about that? And I think the idea is, if Freud's idea of the uncanny is the unhomely. So it's precisely something that you recognize as the home, something that is familiar, and yet something about the familiar is unfamiliar and unsettling. So it's different to go into the wild and be attacked by a Pekni who's on a particular tree. You might be attacked similarly by a tiger if you live in the Sundarban and you go into the forest. There is nothing surprising or unexpected or unnerving about it. It's a different kind of fear. But the fear of going into your home, which, as you described, is the site of safety for the modern bourgeois self and the modern bourgeois family, and then to find that what you think is safe and familiar is actually really unfamiliar, and you're not sure why. You cannot see the faces and hands, the long hands, or the fingers or the ears of the ghost as you could have in another era, and yet you are afraid precisely because you do not know what it is that haunts you. And that in particular is born of the conditions of alienation that are produced specifically by capitalism and its practice of abstraction, which is why ghosts become more abstract, and we learn this by following the figure of the ghost. So for me, that was one of the sort of biggest takeaways from the book, which is if you follow the book, you learn that the nature of fear changes, and what that tells us is about the very specific feeling and the material structures that produce that feeling of fear. Fear as alienation, fear as something that's unnameable. And this is being explored in several other works at the time in different parts of the world in different ways. So one book that came to mind was Mike Tozek's, which you refer in the book as well, which takes the idea of the commodity fetish and looks at how plantation workers in South America describe the devil. And so how sort of the fetish is a very common idea in Marxist theory, but how plantation workers express their fear of the commodity as something that's through the figure of the devil. So that was one of the works that came to mind. Then another interesting work from a different context that came to mind was the work of, ghosts animate in Bengal growing up, but ghosts animate also a lot of literature on the lives of displaced Africans, mostly through structures of slavery, either because they were embedded in forms of spirit healing in sub-Saharan Africa or Gold Coast Africa themselves, or not just spirit healing, but forms and ways of living in the world, which are, as you described, immanent, where beings and spirits inhabit the world along with the living human beings. So Stephanie Smallwood has this book, Saltwater Slavery, where she talks about how in Gold Coast Africa, when where slavery existed even before Atlantic slavery came and institutionalized it on a large scale, but when human beings died, they journeyed into the spirit world and continued to live in the same social space. They continued to inhabit the same social space, but not as bodily beings, as spirit beings. But with the institutionalization of Atlantic slavery, when a person becomes enslaved, they don't become a spirit anymore. And in that sense, they're exiled from the community of beings. It's not that they're exiled from the community of living, but they're exiled from the community of beings. They do not journey into the sphere of spirits that continue to live with their living ones, but they transmutate into commodities, so they become wine and gunpowder. So she doesn't give an answer to whether this is a way that communities where people were being enslaved for whether this was a vernacular expression of what happens when human beings are commodified, but that's one possible explanation. So this book kind of referred back to these themes. There are bodies of work trying to understand what the process of disenchantment that's caused by the rupture of capitalism and its processes of violent, monstrous sort of abstraction. What are the devils? What are the vernacular conceptions, the sort of non-theoretical, but the storytelling versions of capturing and understanding the sort of horrors that is produced by something that is really abstract, but has very concrete effects on people's lives. And I thought this book did a really good job of capturing that through the stories. I was wondering about another couple of interesting, there were so many interesting things the book unpacks. One is when we're looking at the story that you've heard here today is a story of how capitalism brings the sort of abstraction of labor. Concrete labor gets turned and understood as something that is only of value in its sort of abstractable form. But there are two other processes of abstraction that she delved into the book in the 19th century, one of which is the growth of statistics as a form of study. And you can see why, just as the ghost becomes more abstract, the ways of studying the living, or what Foucault calls governmentality, where people get turned into numbers, is also a sort of new a way of abstracting knowledge about the people that the British are governing. So if in the pre-colonial period, governments collected data about births and deaths, they would still be about the stories of what kinds of deaths, or who are the people being buried in the church graveyard, or who are the people born in this parish. The stories are being collected not for the worth of these, the data is not in the numbers. But in the 19th century modern form of enumeration, and colonial rule in India depends a lot on enumeration, the value of the knowledge becomes contained purely in its enumerated form. So it's how many deaths. Can you compare the number of deaths in colonial Calcutta with the number of deaths in colonial Bombay? If Calcutta is like the city of death, like what are the rates of life? So it's this abstract form of knowledge, which kind of, as you describe in the book, takes away the specificity of death. It, on the one hand, disenchants death or demystifies death, but on the other hand, it also takes away all of the human content, the process of engaging with how you dispose of a dead body, or the process of how you understand death itself, or what causes death. So this is one other process of abstraction, which the book goes into. And then another point of simultaneously, the interesting thing is in colonial forms of knowledge production, there's on the one hand this kind of way of studying society through sort of abstract forms of knowledge through numbers, but simultaneously there's also this detailed data collection by ethnographers, which is focused on like the sort of stories and the particularities of particular situations. So that raised a question for me in my mind. Why is it that these two forms of knowledge are kind of coexisting? Because they are both produced by modern capitalism in the colonial form as it is in South Asia. So how do these two, they clearly do coexist. On the one hand, there are all these British trained upper caste Indian anthropologists going and collecting all of this extremely rich and specific data. Simultaneously, there's all of this like abstract form of knowledge being produced through the form of statistics, and also as other works like Tithi Bhattacharya and Kolkata also shows the production of maps, like maps of health, which is another abstract form producing knowledge. So how and why do these two different forms of like one of abstraction and one of like extreme detail of like collecting and sort of almost commodifying knowledge about people in a way, how these two forms kind of coexist and why, and are they both symptoms of, I mean, one clearly is, and I think the other is too, but I just thought that is not a form of knowledge that can be understood through abstraction. And my sort of, I'd like to finish with kind of one question mainly. One was, what does the figure of the ghost do politically for us? So in the talk, I was interested because you shifted to the ghost as a modern ghost. So politically for us, if you're trying to understand the path forward through capitalism and genocide and its violent forms of expropriation, what is the role of the traditional ghost? Because you've hinted that if the modern ghost, if you accept that the modern ghost is a moral ghost, then there's this burden on the ghost of what morality does it espouse. But is there any purpose for the traditional ghost beyond just showing to us that there was a pre-colonial world that was diverse, that was multi-religious, that was syncretic, that was non-moral, that was not abstract? Is the traditional, I mean, this is a genuine question, it's not a hidden question. Throughout the book, I was trying to understand what is the political labor a factual question. And the last thought that came to mind was the book has, the richness of the book is on how many things it touched on and how many ideas it unpacked. So we started with ghosts, but we end with spirits and gods. Like you realize that the ghosts are not so different from gods. You realize that they're not so different from humans. So you have problematized a lot of ideas of what is human, of what is a being, of what is a spirit, and what is a ghost. I thought the one idea that was not probed so much, I'm not saying it has to be, but it does rise a lot, is what is science? And the reason that comes up is because obviously there are these modern Bengalis who are deeply scientific as per their own claims, and they exile the traditional ghosts. And then they simultaneously create this extremely unscientific practice of seances, unless we're claiming that these processes are actually scientific. So, I mean, are we abandoning science as a category entirely? Are we saying, I mean, clearly the ghost is used to critique science as something that is used as a tool for colonialism, for capitalism, and for Brahminic Hinduism. So the ghost does that critique of modern colonial capitalist science. But does that mean, is the resurrection of the ghost a call to kind of abandon the scientific entirely? Or do traditions of actual imminent critiques, Marxist imminent critiques of science, like through the Science for the People tradition, who have tried to mount a critique of science on its own terms, which is not to say that science is simply colonial and simply a tool of capitalism, and thus not to be used, or is there simply put bad science? science that Hindutva uses, science that a lot of the people doing the seance theories are using. So that's just those two political questions, or the questions kind of came up.
Wonderful comments. So in a moment, we'll throw it out to the audience for questions. So you can all be thinking about what to ask the speakers. But I don't know if you want to respond in the meantime to Tania's comments.
Sure. Yeah.
There's a lot there.
So thank you so much for the very, very generous and very creative reading of the book. And for being such an advocate of my pre-colonial ghosts. So the first question was, how does the processes of abstraction on the one hand and detailed record gathering and story gathering coexist? So, you know, the thing about capitalism is it takes different expressions, different parts of the world. So in Europe, for instance, people like the Grimm brothers collected it for a different set of reasons. In India, it was the shock of 1857. For those of you who don't do South Asia, 1857 was a major uprising in the subcontinent, which literally was Britain's or the East India Company's 9/11. So they had ruled for 100 years and been so generous to India and the natives, and then suddenly the bastards had risen up and cut off their heads. And so they couldn't believe it. So, you know, this complete inability to understand 9/11 that came out of the US ruling class at the time was similar in India. But one of the things that the lesson they learned from 1857 was that the Mughal ruling class were the traitors. Yeah, so they had basically betrayed all the care and facilities the British had accorded them, and they had risen up in revolt. And so the British, for two reasons, wanted to go to the countryside. One was that the peasant is idealized as someone who did not rise up, although that's a false idealization, because peasants definitely took part in the 1857 uprising. But you know, the common man was better in a way than these armed soldiers and these educated Mughal ruling class. And the other was, we need to understand their stories better in order to understand these people better, because these people are clearly hiding things from us, because otherwise, how could we not understand that they were about to rise up in revolt? So those two, so Richard Temple, who was the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, says some of these things quite openly. And he is a huge folklorist. He's part of the folklorist society in London. He tries to do similar things in Bengal and encourage people to go out in the countryside. So that's the British part of it. For the Bengali intellectual who is Western educated, who goes out into the countryside, it's a slightly different project. The project is that this is where the true heart of the nation lies, in the countryside, amongst the, you know, sort of innocent peasantry. Okay, so this is where my country as mother's face can be seen. So all of this writing at this time is about how the land is, note that none of this is about the industrial worker, of whom there's quite a few at the time. There's urban workers, urban laborers, but it's this sort of romanticized peasant world that the Bengali intellectual is completely in love with. The peasant woman, oh my God, her sari and her blah, blah, okay? So, and these stories are then gathered in order to present a new image of the nation which is rooted in traditional values, which is rooted in caste distinctions, and so on. So those things are emphasized. So those are the twin kind of, I would say, from the Indian side and from the British side, why these poor ghosts are captured in these stories. And remember, we are getting these stories in written form, and I wonder, and I wish I knew what kind of transmutations they have undergone in order to appear to us. We know some of them that these people sanitize, but we can never get the full extent of that. Yeah. So that's your first question, I think. I know the third one was about science. What was the second one?
The political work that the white ghosts do.
What is the political work of the ghosts? Thank you. I think I don't know exactly, but in today's context, in the two places that I study and that I talk about to some extent are India and Palestine. And there, I think the pre-colonial ghosts play a very important role to remind us that coexistence is not just necessary, it is possible because it once was. Okay, so if you look at Usama Makdisi's work, he's a historian of Palestine. If you look at his work, you will see how he records the Ottoman Palestine territory, and in fact, the Ottoman Middle East, how coexistence was not a special virtue, it was just a way of being. Yes? So you didn't sort of necessarily celebrate the Jewish neighbor having breaking bread with the Sunni neighbor, yeah? It was just a part of society, so it wasn't any credit to anyone that, oh, look how syncretic they are, yeah? And so that's the same in these ghost stories. I think they show us that this world existed, which means it can exist in the future. And in India and Palestine, this is very, very important to understand, not on the terms of what the Zionists argue, which is the two-state solution, which is at its root the acknowledgement that Jewish people cannot live side by side with Palestinian people. I mean, this is just completely contrary to the stories and folk tales that Palestinians tell of each other of a pre-Zionist, pre-colonial, pre-British world. So not a two-state solution, but a one-state solution. And in the case of India, that the Muslim and the Dalit are not subjects to be lynched, but are full citizens and part of the braided history of the subcontinent. The science, I did not talk about it a great deal because Gyan Prakash had already done it a lot, and other people following Gyan had done it. However, I would like to point out that the bourgeoisie is the most superstitious class in creation because it believes that commodities and the market are real. So, I mean, it believes in the abstraction, it believes in the power of capitalism. So it is the greatest kind of superstition that you can hold. So I think it is only natural that they would be scared by the abstract ghost.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to open it up to you all now. Do you have questions, comments, engagements?
Snide remarks.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I have two questions. They're kind of unrelated. The first was pertaining to the early slide you had of the coasters. The coasters, you have
The coasters, yeah.
with the different coasts on there. So I'm quite interested to get from you a sense of why do you feel there's this resurgence in resurgent popular interest in ghosts? As you said, there was in Calcutta, the coasters, evidently. pointing to that. And the second question I had was more of a comment, when you said that everywhere in the world in general, there is this sort of absorption, shall we say, or incorporation, as you said, of a variety of different kinds of pre-modern beings into one templated Gothic style ghost. And I wondered what you had to say really about the Caribbean there. I noticed there was in the response, there was a comment about, the Gold Coast and so on. But basically, as we know, a place like Haiti, is full of all kinds of beings like zombies, but apart from zombies who are pretty well known, I would say there are also these in the French Caribbean, these soucouyons, and there are all kinds of spirits, many of them also female and malevolent and powerful in the ways you describe them, who are still associated with, because of the plantation world, with the countryside, and they are not domiciled in big houses. And very interestingly, for your argument about where these ghosts from the South Asian, say from Bengal, are exiled, there are also a whole bunch of Indo-Caribbean ghosts, the Petnis, Churayas, and so on, are still alive and roaming in the Caribbean, as indeed they are in Mauritius and Fiji. So I'm just wondering what you would make of that exile of our pre-modern ghosts to spaces, like the plantation spaces of places where also there were these earlier, like African diasporic ghosts multiplying and roaming, and they were, I don't see them as following the Gothic template. So I'd be very interested in your views on that, but also on what's happening in Calcutta today with all these concepts.
Thank you. We'll take a few if that's okay. Anybody else like to follow that?
Let's want to go first.
Yeah, do you want to go first?
Thanks so much for the talk. So I wanted to also ask a little bit about the universalizing element as well. And I wanted to ask where Islam and Islamic forms of supernatural beings may come to the story, because of course it's Bengal, there's Hindus, there's Muslims as well. Because I'm thinking about jinns and some of the work that's been done on jinns, not maybe translated as ghosts, but perhaps beings. And Anant Taneja's work, Genealogy, actually talks about how ideas about jinns have persisted despite colonial changes, despite post-colonial changes. And so how might that kind of offer a different narrative of what is happening, in this same time frame?
Thank you so much for this amazing talk and fantastic book. I've read the introduction, chapter 3, chapter 5, and the conclusion. So some of the questions that I have, it's mostly a comment actually, that sort of ends in a question, might have already been addressed in the chapters that I have written. So apologies in advance if that's the case. So the first one is about the place of history and sort of historical thinking in your work, which I've seen you sort of reference in the chapters that I've read. So on the one hand, we're talking about, I think as you put it, and then Tanya reiterated, the historicization of ghosts. But at the same time, we're also talking about a moment in which historical thinking itself is emerging, and ghosts are being used as a way of cementing ideas of historical time, futurity and pastness and linearity. So anything you can say that would sort of, speak to that kind of, maybe, I don't know if it's a tension, but, on the one hand, we're doing history. On the other hand, we're talking about the rise of the very sort of forms of historical thinking that are a hallmark of modernity. So that's sort of one question. And then the second one is, I've been really excited to see a work that is putting into conversation questions of, in my own words, I would say sort of questions of the economy, or the rise of the economic, in your renditions of capitalism, with the rise of another category that is a category of modernity, which is religion. And so I guess scholarship often doesn't place these two things in conversation. There's a whole very rich literature on the emergence of religion as a category with its sort of Protestant, Western, Christian history. And I guess, one question I had was, how does your work engage maybe that latter literature? The rise of the category of religion being something that expels these pre-modern ghosts? Is that something that you could speak to? And then secondly, it's so this is more sort of a point of confusion. So I'm aware of sort of the arguments that have been made about sort of abstraction being one of the effects of the rise of capitalism. You know, some people talk about real abstractions, but I'm still sort of struggling to pin down beyond a move from kind of heterogeneity to homogeneity, why it is that capitalism requires the expulsion of ghosts. Just if you could kind of spell out in a very sort of basic way why it's capitalism that has to be the generator of that, as opposed to, for instance, modernity, colonial modernity, you know, the whole host of transformations that your book actually lays out for us that don't necessarily have an integral relationship with the transformation of labor in particular, from sort of concrete to abstract.
Okay. Thank you for that question, which is actually related to the JITs. So the first one about why there is a rise of ghost stories in India at the moment, because it's not just Bengal. I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think one of the things that people like during really bad political moments is fantasy, and fantasy is also safe because it doesn't comment on current situations. So that may be one, that under fascism we would rather watch ghost stories of feisty women rather than look at what's happening to our Dalit comrades. So I don't know. But what is very clear is my pre-capitalist ghosts are being monetized and made into commodities and sold into perfectly not ghostly drawing rooms. So the second question, which is the most serious one, which is about the how can I say these have been exiled when these beings clearly exist? And that's true for Bengal as well. I mean, if you go to a countryside, people will still tell you that there is a ghost that don't go under that tree because a ghost lives. Things have happened. They no longer say ghost. They say things have happened. Don't go under that, and so on. So that it exists. What I am trying to point out is just because capitalism is the dominant mode of social reproduction of society doesn't mean that other modes do not coexist alongside of it. So, in the Grundrisse, Marx talks very beautifully about how capitalism orchestrates all the other forms. Okay, so it's the conductor. Okay, it conducts and makes it the major tone, while everybody else is sort of playing to its tune, as it were. So it orchestrates, but it also means something else. It means it also means that these beings no longer scare the rational human. Okay, like you wouldn't go to a university and say, I believe in jinns, they have done this, or there's a course on jinns, okay, that these are actually true beings that I want to investigate. So rationality, the place of reason has abandoned these pre-modern beings, even if the pre-modern beings continue to exist in the margins of social thought and social belief. But this is not something that is spoken about. This is not something, you will not find them in the horror section of any of your, whichever bookshop you're talking about. Where you'll find them is in folk tales, you'll find them in children's literature, and you'll find them in academic books, which we write about these beings, right? So these are not beings that actually scare the majority of people living in the harsh glare of the electric light. That's a metaphor that a lot of the 19th century writers write, that, you know, when the electricity comes on, it banishes the ghost into the shadows and to the darkness. So that's would be my answer, that I didn't necessarily say that they don't exist. I'm saying that they no longer are feared in the same way that they are by the vast majority of people. So modern reason is something very different from pre-modern forms of rationality, which are multifarious and varied. To ask the question about history was your question. So I don't know which chapter, maybe it's chapter 3, where I talk about the historical work that the Gothic does, okay? Where, so one of the arguments I make is all these pre-modern ghosts are in the wild. They're in forests and countryside and so on. The modern Gothic is always inside these palatial mansions and these, you know, crumbling houses and so on. But even in that, there is a distinction. The British modern ghost is always based in a British town. Okay, so like Calcutta or Simla or whatever. Whereas the Bengali modern ghost is always based in outside of colonial towns, okay? So the argument I make is that British ghosts lend to empire and these newfangled towns a historicity that they lack. Right? So when you have a ghost, it is supposed to invoke tradition and oldness and pastness, and it lends this historicity to these very, very modern cities, which have no history, so to speak of. And this is why Bengali authors cannot place them in Calcutta, because Calcutta is a newfangled town without history, without tradition, without any of this. So they always place it in old Mughal mansions or Mughal towns or so on. So Delhi as a town can have ghosts because it's an ancient city, but Calcutta as a upstart town cannot have ghosts as far as the Indian mind is concerned. But the British think very, very differently. So that's the way I try to talk into modernity, to historicity. So the ghosts play a part in making history for the colonial states. At least the British ghosts do. To your question of why capitalism, I think there might be a slight difference of opinion here, because I see colonial modernity or modernity in general as an effect of capitalism rather than as a self-standing, unconnected piece of society. I see modernity. So here, you know, all that solid melts into air. Marshall Berman is my guru on this, where he shows very clearly the relationship between capitalist forms of the economy, of culture, etc. So capitalism, this is another argument I make in the book, that when you read sort of accounts of what people think is capitalism, even from orthodox Marxists, you tend to only read economic accounts. Okay, but capitalism is not just the economy. It is a way of life. And what capitalism does, it reorganizes life, because you cannot lead your life the way you used to in a pre-capitalist form under capitalism. Okay, so all of this abstraction of labor, commodification sounds very abstract, but you have to think of capitalism as coming in, taking your land, or bulldozing your your previous house in order to build something and make you either a servant in that town or a poorly paid informal worker in that in that shopping mall or whatever. So it is an entirely different way of organizing life, and that is how I see modernity, that this new way of organizing life, to see oneself as modern, one must have capitalism to sustain that idea of the modern. And historically, that's what's happened. Once, capitalist social relations start to take place, the notions of modernity starts to emerge, that this is completely new. And it is. It is completely new, and it is where all that solid melts into air. So I don't see the two processes as vastly different.
Can I just,
Of course.
just on the specific point of labor and the move from the concrete to the abstract, how do you go from that particular, since it was on the PowerPoint, from that to the expulsion of the older ghosts, the pre-modern ghosts? Why does what the latter follow from the former? That's the thing I'm struggling to get ahead of.
Of course. And so the argument I make is this, and you may buy it or not, is that capitalism as a societal system requires the expulsion of diversification and the homogenization of all social life into particular forms, and which are and this is
Including one notion of the human, is that right?
Correct.
Like, so a
Correct.
very narrow understanding.
and the question of human nature, all of this has to have singular expressions under capitalism, okay? And so the diverse beings are incorporated into one ghost. And this is why even the names are lost sometimes of these various beings, and definitely their powers are lost as well. So the ghost is the only thing that the modern mind fears, not all these other diverse beings.
More questions, Sarah?
Thank you, Tithi. This is fascinating, and the book is gives us so much to think about. I guess I want to sort of. There are a few questions I have. One of them will carry on from this conversation around abstraction in two ways. The first is I actually wanted a little bit more of a just kind of, if you could delve deeper into this idea around home, which I found fascinating, right? So you're saying that capitalism kind of disinvests the space of the domestic from so many activities, and then it becomes specifically just a space of pleasure, right? And so I was very curious why you saw that the transformation to leisure brings in the ghost. I think that I kind of missed that, and I feel like it might kind of relate to this question around labor a little bit. But the other question I had around abstraction is actually related to something you say in the introduction around the kind of heterogeneity of the processes of capitalism, right? And I was curious, and you kind of go into history 1, history 2, but then I kind of lose that thread when we get to these generalizing arguments around the generalization, sort of the universal ghost, the Gothic ghost, and the exile of the multiplicity of ghosts and beings, right? And I was curious where you were seeing heterogeneity in terms of process, and where you were seeing kind of this universalizing logic of capital operating in particular ways. I mean, I guess I wanted a little bit more of that tension in your kind of view for the book. Then I have a very different question. And I don't know if it's epistemology or methodology, but we had our talk right before reading week was with Nikki Falkov, who was talking about the occult, conspiracy, and so on in South Africa today. And we had a conversation there around thinking about rumors, conspiracies, and so on from our position as scholars, right? And it brought up this question around belief, right? And how we kind of articulate what we are studying, right? If it is, for example, that you don't believe that what is being said is in fact fact, right? These can and dub them conspiracies. I mean, just the one kind of the productivity of, I guess I think the way in which you in the book talk about beings is really productive in the sense that you're kind of inhabiting the space with those beings that gives them the space to articulate who they are and what they're doing, right? And so a little bit of method, right, in terms of how you got to the point of being able to articulate that, but then a question around whether we can ever fully and truly appreciate, for example, a social history of pre-modern fear, if we as modern subjects cannot experience or sense the kind of fear that the subjects you are describing, right, or the relationship they have with those beings. And so I guess I just want to kind of open that up a little bit. And I wish we would talk a little bit more about jinn, because I don't know if they necessarily sit outside of a modern rationality in the same way, but I'll stop now.
I'd really love to abuse my position. It's like really hard to sit here and be quiet. But I suppose just in relation to your question about the home, Sarah, all through your talk, I was thinking about, because I work on political ecology in Indonesia, so we talk a lot about how the forest there, in particular in Kalimantan, Dayak territories, you have spirits there who perform a very specific regulatory function, as in, because of this particular spirit in this forest, you can't take anything at all. Because of this spirit in this forest, you can take something. So actually spirits I know that's like slightly different to ghosts, but maybe not really, but they are performing this regulatory function in specifically around the regulation of the commons. So yeah, it was really interesting to me to think a little bit about what kind of regulatory function a ghost then performs under capitalism, or why would they go into the home, if you like. Maybe there's something there around the home being aside from a space of leisure, like your work shows brilliantly, or other work, also a space of value production for capitalism. So is there an element there that the spirit is performing a regulatory function around social reproduction? And yeah, I had one other, a kind of speculative electoral question, which is, what kind of ghosts are we going to get under communism? Is that something that you?
Oh, that would be so great to speculate.
Samir.
So my question is sort of, I feel very happy that many people have raised the jinns questions, because really love to hear your take on that. In some ways, I'm asking my question because I'm steeped in the archives where books operate in Bengal as spaces where these creatures that you're calling beings actually are catapulted into the future, right? Like the kinds of texts from manuscript puthis to printed puthis in which various forms of these deities and so on are living. And I was thinking about the way that, from manuscript to printed book, they kind of jump, if you will, from the 18th century to 19th century to a particular moment in Boddola production in Kolkata, etc. And I was wondering where your book sits on that, because I was, in the transition from that kind of printed culture into your finding new life in your book, for example, as beings that will be catapulted into the future or not. I was wondering whether the category of ghost or the category of being, is that deadening them? Is it allowing them to actually live on? And I was really interested in Tania's sort of discussion about your earlier chapters, because it sounds like there's ambivalence and ambiguity in your dealing with
the ghosts versus the beings. You didn't want to actually reduce them to ghosts, right? So, but it sounds like you came up with the term being as a way of not reducing them. But I guess I was struck by just listening to everyone talk and to also reading the chapter, if capitalism / modernity is homogenizing these figures, where does your book and your scholarship sit in that? Are you also homogenizing these figures? I don't know, these are some of the thoughts that occurred to me.
Yeah. Thank you. This was fantastic. I didn't sit in a South Asia history seminar for a long time. I wondered, Tithi, about the link with the repression of sexuality in the context that you're writing about. And I'm just making a bit of a stretch of a comparison. But when, of course, if we compare it to the idea of the witch, right, that Federici talks about, that as a material sort of basis in the process of burning to death women during the Inquisition. But he also has then an otherworldly sort of function that it starts to perform in terms of domination over what was seen as a hypersexualization of women in that period. So you just do have tropes that, regardless of material or non-material basis, then are performed to repress women in a specific way. And I wonder if your ghosts, your Gothic ghosts in the context of West Bengal do perform this function as well, especially as you have made reference with the picture you showed as well, how that takes place exactly in Western context, where you do have in paintings a lot of representation of these ghosts actually going against women or against sort of those that are supposed to perform a certain way. So I wonder if there was that aspect of moralization that is particularly gendered in that context as well.
And the short answer is yes, very much so.
And how? Yeah, that would be my interest.
Okay, we'll hand back over to you, and then hopefully we'll have time for one more round.
Okay, great. So thank you for all of those lovely questions. More chance to talk about my bees. So let's start with the home, because both your questions have resonance for each other. So home, in my reading of capitalism, home is evacuated of work, as it were. Well, capitalist version of work. Obviously, as Alexandra and I talk about home, it's very much doing very important work, without which capitalism cannot survive, but acknowledged by capitalism work. So home is a space that's evacuated by work that capitalism tries to acknowledge as work, right? So unlike a pre-capitalist world where production was based inside the home. And so it becomes a place of leisure, it becomes a place of safety and solitude, and something that you get away from work to go into. So of course it doesn't hold for women and other gender differently people, but that's how the dominant idea of the home. So in the bourgeois, so the Gothic form, as many have shown way before me, is the bourgeois form of horror. Okay, so the relationship between the bourgeois world and the Gothic world has been studied, particularly by literature people to quite an extent. The Victorian Gothic, et cetera, et cetera. So I wasn't going to make a contribution in that regard, but my understanding how that draws into Bengali stories is as follows. As I show in one of the chapters by looking at it, that the home is very well appointed where the ghost often appears. Yeah, so it's hardly ever in a sort of a council estate or wherever that the ghost appears. So it's often in the classic Gothic mode, it's often castles or, whatever. And they all bear a certain similarity to each other, darkness, weird sounds, swishing things, etc. And so this is for the bourgeois self, this was the safest of havens. And here the wild has now intruded upon it. Yeah. So the ghost must be exorcised. That's the common dictum for the ghost, that it must be thrown out of the home because the home is a sacred place. The home is a place of domesticity and safety and care and so on. And this sort of immoral creature does not have a place in the bourgeois family or the bourgeois heteronormative family anyway. So that, in a way, also because the bourgeois self doesn't go into the dark forest to, hunt for deer or whatever. That's not the bourgeois purpose. If it was, that was his way of life, then he would probably encounter Gothic ghosts in the forest. But the bourgeois way of life is going to work and coming back into the home, and that's where the ghost then resides. Yeah. Let me tell you how much your point is correct. And I make that point in the book by relating to you the famous story of Tagore that then Satyajit Ray, another famous man, makes into a very famous film. And the central character is a woman, of course. And what are the characteristics of this woman? She's very beautiful, but she's obsessed with her jewelry. Okay, she's obsessed with her jewelry and guards the jewelry and her jewelry box or safe or whatever vault with fanaticism. And of course, this woman is barren. Okay, does not have children. In her heart, the jewelry box has replaced the child. The author writes this. And this is why this unnatural desire leads to her death. Of course, she has to die, right? No children, obsessed with beauty and jewelry, she is going to die. On a dark and stormy night, she tries to flee with her jewelry box, and she's killed by a first cousin because he wanted the jewels, right? So she's dead. But of course, she comes to haunt because she comes to look for her jewels. And also, the moral is, if she had lived the normal life of a good domestic wife with children and, adequate disinterest in her own self, then she wouldn't have turned into a ghost, because it's that unfulfillment, that sexual desire that makes her come back and haunt it. And when she comes back, it is described in excruciating detail. Again, the poor hapless husband is in the house, and suddenly the window bangs, and then the sound, there's a sound he hears of anklets, yeah? No, sorry, he hears the sound of jewelry, all kinds of jewelry, jangling, jingling, And the way Tagore describes this is exquisite. The sound embraces every bourgeois object in the room. Okay, the teacups, the table, the saucers, and it draws the hapless husband into this, net of dread. Okay, just that sound. So that's how it goes through. But this is the standard procedure for early Gothic novels in Europe. It's always a woman who's dead and who's haunting, who led a somewhat unfulfilled life or was murdered for being a bad person or whoever. So it's her own fault, as it were. And this idea, if a woman has, unnatural desires of any kind, she's bound to end up being killed in a Gothic novel and come back to haunt. So it's the sort of raison d'etre of the Gothic novel. So very much about gender and sexuality, and driving home, like the driving stake into any kind of non-heteronormative gendered expectations, because that's the worst that can happen to you. you become a ghost. Like,
We've just got a few minutes left. I think we can squeeze in. I know there's a question at the back. Do you want to do?
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed your talk. I'd be curious if there's like, do you think, and sorry if you've written about this already or if it's an obvious like answer, but is there something particular about the uncanny? Like why it's the Gothic form that emerges and why it's like experiencing the ghost as the uncanny, as and like I guess from a Freudian sense, if that's like an encounter with the repressed, whether again like whether sexuality, whether it's like commodity form, although I think commodity fetish works differently. Yeah, I don't know. It seemed really interesting to me that uncanny emerges at this particular time.
well, here I'm Freudian in the argument. So Freud makes the argument that that which is unheimlich is uncanny because it actually is an echo of the Heimlich. So it is something that is recognizable that you have repressed somehow that comes back in some kind of a form and you recognize it, but it's the root of the recognition that is also the root of the fear because it is the recognition that you suppressed. So in other words, you are scared of the color yellow for some reason, and that is because of, some kind of traumatic event in your past where the dispenser of the trauma reminded you of something yellow or was wearing something yellow or something, and you repressed that. So it's the familiar coming back. And the very fact that you recognize the familiar is the root of the unfamiliar, because it hasn't come back in the earlier form, because that would be the root of the trauma and you could probably resolve it. But it is the unfamiliar is particularly scary or uncanny because it is familiar.
Does that come like, is that particular to capitalist racial things?
I don't know if it's capitalist, but it is the Gothic form, is what I argue. So, but well, not I, Freud argues.
So we're nearly up to time, so I think we can leave it there. We could definitely go on all night and listen to both the wonderful speakers. But yeah, I'm sure you all have homes to go to. So if you can just join me in thanking. We have Francois Vergers right here, same time, same place.
Thank you so much.